Righty, boys and girls. All righty, boys and girls. How are you today? Hopefully, life is good at your end. It is 0 degrees here today in Vermtown, so hopefully it's a little warmer wherever you are. Today we're doing Ethics 101, which is that small little 104-page book that we had assigned. And I was hoping to have the PowerPoints up that I could use with this, but my technology system, like most days, doesn't seem to be working very well. But you should be able to find the PowerPoints under the week 2 content. They should be there, so take a look at them and you should be able to follow along. This week we have assigned the ABC Greed movie. It's about 45 minutes long. It's an interesting narrated documentary by John Stossel, who is an investigative reporter, and it's really excellent. The movie is about the subject of greed and whether or not greed is a bad thing. Now, while most of us would say, wow, of course greed is a bad thing. Well, I think he makes a really good argument that, greed is not a bad thing, that everything in proportion, not excess, is perhaps a very good thing. But you take a look and see what you think at the end of the 45-minute documentary. Now, there'll be a quiz that you're going to be taking too, so pay attention to what you're looking at and taking a few notes, because I think you'll find it interesting and maybe even change your perspective a little bit. Well, then, it's time to move into the business ethics book 101. And I think the Business Ethics Book 101 is a great book because it's a business ethics book, and I think you'll find it fascinating with lots of interesting examples. So I think we probably begin with the fundamental question. When people make unethical choices, why do they make unethical choices? So why did those 5,300 employees at Wells Fargo make the unethical choice of opening up credit card accounts, line of credit accounts, and others without the permission of their account holders? In other words, those 5,300 employees engaged in criminal and civil fraud. So why did they make that unethical choice? And we previously discussed, how do you define ethics? And ethics is fundamentally, as Socrates would say, ethics is about correct decision making. Unethical conduct is wrong decision making. And so this would be a good example that I think most people would say, yes, I think the conduct of the 5,300 employees was, in fact, unethical. And if that is true, then I think you can turn it over on the other side and realize, well, ethical conduct is correct conduct. Or as Socrates liked to observe, he said, well, ethics is what you ought to do. I think that's a good characterization. So what are 3 reasons why people make unethical decisions? The first one being, we do what's most convenient. So, for example, when faced with a ethical dilemma, And how do we define an ethical dilemma? An unpleasant choice relating to a moral principle or practice. And thinking about the undesirable choice, some people decide, well, they're going to do what's most convenient when faced with an undesirable choice. A second reason why people make unethical decisions is we do what we must to win. And I think that was the situation that many of the Wells Fargo employees found themselves under intense pressure, and there were bonuses and all sorts of seductive incentives to try and get employees. I think the phrase was there at Wells Fargo, 8 is great. The point being trying to open up 8 new accounts for every customer they already had. And so they did what they thought they had to do in order to win. That is to satisfy their bosses and to gain the seductive incentives that were being offered. 8 is great. A third reason is that we rationalize our choices with relativism. That is, we look at ethical problems through what is most advantageous to ourselves. Relativist lens viewing, if you will. And so rather than do the right thing, we may do the wrong thing because it's in our best interest, we think, at the time. So the 3 reasons summed up are: first, we do what's most convenient; second, we do what we must to win; and third, we rationalize our choices with relativism. And so we're seeing today, and I think your Wells Fargo, or not your Wells Fargo, but your Wall Street Journal should be sharing with you that there are all sorts of things going on out there in the business world from time to time that certainly cross the ethical lines. And so there is demand out there, not just by shareholders, but also by employees, the government, investors, and so forth, wanting transparency in behavior. That is, they want to know what the numbers really are for a company. And going back to 2000 and 2001, when we had not only the collapse and the largest bankruptcy in history with WorldCom, but also the collapse of Enron, that was considered to be one of the top, Fortune 100 companies and all. How is it possible that all these high-flying companies, can go belly up in such a short period of time? Well, the problem was, if you will, cooking the books. There was rampant falsification, fraud, if you will, of accounting reports, which subsequently led in early 2002 to the enactment of Sarbanes-Oxley, creating all sorts of new requirements for accountants, CFOs, and CEOs, requiring them to now personally authenticate, that is, sign all documents going to the SEC and other governmental agencies, making them personally liable for any mistakes or errors in that accounting data. It's sometimes, Sarbanes-Oxley sometimes has been referred to as the Full Employment Act for accountants, in that so many of the publicly traded firms added a lot of accountants to their staffs, because you can imagine what CEO or CFO wants to sign a document that may send them to jail, like Ken Lay at Enron and Jeffrey Skilling and Arthur Fastow. Folks don't want to sign those things unless they really absolutely positively know the accounting information is correct. So we've gone from, cooking the books to certainly a significant amount of regulatory control, not just with Sarbanes-Oxley, but as we saw again in 2008 with the enactment of Dodd-Frank. So there is a demand out there, a public demand, that businesses and business leaders be transparent in the good and the bad and the ugly financial data of their firm. So let's take, for example, John Stumpf, the then CEO at Wells Fargo, who was hauled before the United States Senate Financial Services Committee to explain the 5,300 employees and huge fraudulent schemes that were ongoing at Wells Fargo. Now, Mr. Stumpf didn't see the firing of the 5,300 employees or what happened at Wells Fargo as being serious, which is what astounded the members of the committee. And his explanation, when asked and pinned down on the issue of why don't you consider this a serious ethical or legal problem, he said, well, because it only involved 1.7 of Wells Fargo's assets, a very small number. And because it involves such a small percentage of their assets, they didn't consider it serious at his level or at the board of directors level. Well, the members of that Senate committee just, were incredibly shocked with his explanation and laissez-faire attitude towards fraud, civil and criminal. And so by the time he got back to Wells Fargo's headquarters in San Francisco, he was unemployed. So the question comes up from time to time, questioning about, motivation and what motivates behavior. And there's a great article that I want to commend to you by a former Goldman Sachs executive. His name is Greg Lewis. And so I recommend you go on YouTube or Google and type in Greg Lewis Wall Street Journal op-ed, and an article will pop up in which he essentially rats out what had been ongoing at Goldman Sachs, which made him quit because he found the systems and goals at Goldman Sachs to encourage and reward unethical behavior. And so merely firing a few employees for misconduct, as in the case of Wells Fargo, doesn't solve your problem when the company itself is, if you will, basically corrupt when it comes to financial and ethical goals. And so he talks about that at Goldman Sachs, wherein Goldman Sachs brokers were instructed to call their clients and to talk them into purchasing junk. Now, you would think, now, wait a minute, these are your brokers that are supposed to be looking out for your best interest. And now they are, on their own volition, calling you and persuading you to buy stock and bonds that they know to be junk, but of course you don't. So he found that highly unethical. And so it's sometimes referred to as an ethical flea dip, and that's what the author in Ethics 101 calls it. Look, firing a few people is not going to solve the institutional problem if the goals and the environment in the company remain the same. And again, I think Wells Fargo is an excellent current example of that situation, where Wells Fargo still has many serious problems now in their mortgage division and others that indicate a much more deep-seated ethical problem in that company that I think the leaders, certainly the members of the board of directors, are responsible for. The author asks the question, so what type of issue is an ethical problem? What type of issue is it? Is it a business issue? Is it a social issue? Is it a political issue? Or is it a personal issue? And so the author, I think, makes a good argument for why you should view it as a personal issue in all situations. So how about this question? Do companies that are dedicated to doing the right thing possess a written commitment to social responsibility and act on it consistently more profitable than those who do not? Let me say that again. Do companies that are dedicated to doing the right thing possess a written commitment to social responsibility and act on it consistently? Are they more profitable than those who don't? Would you be surprised to learn that yes, they are more profitable? Research shows. Why is that? Well, is ethics and competence a winning equation? Why is that, would you guess? Why is ethics and competence a winning equation? Well, ethics involving the golden rule, doing to others as you would have done unto you, and at the same time wanting to do the right thing for the right reason, and then being professionally competent in your particular business occupation. Those two things together, research shows, are a winning equation. How about this from your own personal experience? Do people who continually test the edge of ethics and inevitably go over the edge? Have you noticed that? People that you have found to be unethical eventually go over the edge, go too far, or become caught up? Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It is not sustainable behavior. Sooner or later, the truth is going to catch up with them. In the long haul, do deeds catch up with unethical leaders because the truth ultimately comes out? Well, we've seen lots of that in Wall Street Journal articles, right? When the truth gets, spilled sooner or later. The whole ongoing controversy over sexual harassment, I think, is a good, case in point. That eventually, this type of conduct is going to become public, and that's going to trigger all sorts of reactions. How about this one? In the long term, do people always lose when they live without ethics? I think there's a lot of research data to, show that. Certainly, I think Mr. Stump at CEO, at the former CEO now at Wells Fargo, would have something to, say about that. Is asking the question, how would I like to be treated in this situation, an integrity guideline for virtually any situation? I think we're back to the golden rule, aren't we? Treat others the way you want to be treated. And if you do that, then that's a good integrity guideline that isn't terribly complicated and certainly isn't a gray subject. So what are the two most important points when it comes to ethics? Certainly, as our author argues, he says the first is the standard to follow, and second is the will to follow it. Now, going back to my earlier representation that, often ethical challenges may be stressful and, are a choice between, unpleasant options. And so that's when it becomes important to know, so what standard do you follow, and do you have the will to follow it? And so having a standard, if you will, an ethical model, a set of ethical principles, can help guide you when you are conflicted and are faced with an undesirable choice, between two or more options. So the author asks the question, is ethics about how we meet the challenge of doing the right thing when doing the right thing will cost more than we are willing to pay? Yes, it may very well in a number of cases pose that problem. That it's the challenge of doing the right thing when we know it may cost us more than we're willing to pay. So there are two aspects to be considered here. One is the ability to discern right from wrong, good from evil, propriety from impropriety. And secondly, a commitment to do what is right, good, and proper. Let me tell you the story of a criminal I had in Korea. I was the chief prosecutor for the American Army there from 1984 to 86. And we had a real professional criminal by the name of Darren D. Jones. He's dead now. But Darren was a soldier, and he had gotten caught stealing electronic gear out of the barracks in Tongashan in northern Korea, where the 2nd Infantry Division was stationed. And a soldier engaging in barracks thievery is a pretty serious matter. He was actually caught and tried, prosecuted, and convicted, and sent off before I arrived in 1984. But he went to Fort Riley, Kansas, actually, was where he was imprisoned. And he told his people there, the prison authorities, that he had AIDS. And so they took him to Fitzsimmons Hospital in Denver, and sure enough, he had AIDS. And so they kept him there. But because of pretty loose security, would you believe Darren D. Jones, with his AIDS, walked out of the hospital? So he forged a government form and got on a military plane back to Korea. And he rounded up these Korean prostitutes that had worked for him before, and because they would fence, that is, sell the electronic gear that he would steal. And so he went back into business. And of course, as you might imagine, with these Korean prostitutes, he engaged in extracurricular sexual activity with them, obviously, spreading his AIDS to them. So sure enough, we have a number of thefts. Of course, I'm on the scene by now. And Darren gets caught a second time by our criminal investigation command. And he's brought down to Seoul, where I am, and he claims he's got AIDS. And of course, we put him in the hospital, and our hospital commander confirms, yes, he's got, stage 5 AIDS. That is really serious. We need to get him out of country. And of course, my argument is, wait a minute, we need to prosecute this guy. Well, Seoul was going to be hosting the Asian games coming up the next year, and so they had advertised that they had no AIDS or other communicable diseases in Korea, and so everybody should come, and tourists and all and whatnot. And so there was intense political pressure for us to get Darren D. Jones out of Korea. So against my arguments, they brought him to Fort Leavenworth, and that's where we tried him. And so we tried him for his larceny and other activities. And when I was reading him his charges, actually in the hospital before we shipped him from Seoul to Fort Leavenworth, I'm reading the charges that we're charging him. You're required to read and accuse the charges you're preferring against him. He looks at me and he says, "How can you charge a dying man?" And of course, I asked him, well, how can you infect with AIDS all of these Korean prostitutes that you had working for you? And he said, easy, it's not like they're real people. Well, Darren was a real criminal. He could not tell the difference between right or wrong, nor did Darren care to. And that's what made him dangerous. And so the ability to discern right from wrong, good from evil, and propriety from impropriety involves being, having a commitment to the good, the right, and the proper. And unfortunately, with some criminals, they have no desire whatsoever to discern right from wrong, and that's what makes them dangerous. The end of the story is we prosecuted Darren, and of course, his argument was that, any sentence of more than a year was going to be a death sentence. And my argument to the jury is yes, we want to pack him away until he does die because he's a walking time bomb. So the jury gave him 10 years. And I remember a little more than a year later, the commandant calling me in Korea, telling me that Darren D. Jones had just died. And I said, fine. That was, in his case, a good thing because that way he couldn't infect other people because he had no ethics whatsoever. So why is the golden rule considered to be a win-win proposition? I don't think this is brain surgery. If I treat you as well as I desire to be treated, you win. If you treat me likewise, I win. So I think there is harmony and peace to be found in following a moral compass that points in the same direction regardless of fashion or trend. And so I think the golden rule, and there's been arguments that, look, if you have the golden rule in your company, you really don't need any other rules. I think that's an interesting observation. So how about this? Why do over 70% of people quit their jobs? What is the reason for that? Any ideas? Well, would you be surprised to learn that over 70% who leave their job, that's right, don't feel valued. That's why they quit. And so encouragement is sometimes referred to as oxygen for the soul. I think that's true. And the foundation of all good relationships is trust. So what is the problem with the perception that you're being taken advantage of? I think that goes back to value, that you're being taken advantage of, you're being undervalued. And so that's why a lot of people decide to take their talent and skills elsewhere, and rightly so. Who is the chief people officer in a company? I love this one. The author is right about that. It's the chief people officer in a company is the person responsible for shepherding the company's corporate culture and making effective and intense its ethical standards of leadership. So sometimes that could be the CEO himself. It could also be the chief of HR. But it needs to be somebody who takes ownership of the ethical standards in the company. And so if the CEO isn't going to take that on as a personal responsibility, somebody else needs to be able to speak truth to power, to argue why ethical decisions need to follow the company's code. And so one of the things Sarbanes-Oxley requires is that all companies have to have a written code of ethics. I suggest that's a good thing. Well, look, these are the ethical issues that I wanted to discuss with you today. I think you're going to enjoy the Greed movie. I highly commend it to you. Take some notes because there'll be a quizzy on it. Okay? All right. We will connect again next week. I again invite your questions by email that come up, and I'll do my best to get back with you forthwith. Carry on. Bye-bye, guys.